The box of secrets in every family isn't always locked away in the attic. Sometimes it lives in silence, hidden in the pauses of conversations and the guarded looks we give the ones we love most. When my daughter Sarah walked down the aisle, radiant in her grandmother's wedding dress, no one in that church knew I was holding back a truth worth $30 million. I had chosen not to speak, not to reveal the beachfront empire my late husband left me. That decision, born of instinct and unease, would prove to be the only shield I had against the man she had just vowed to spend her life with. 2 years earlier, my husband Thomas had died of a sudden heart attack, leaving behind a string of real estate investments along the California coast, Malibu, Carmel, Monterey, names that made people dream of wealth and beauty. But to me, they were the foundation of a life built through decades of risk and persistence. Thomas had been a man who could see potential where others saw sand and salt. Together, we had transformed his vision into a thriving empire. And when he was gone, the responsibility of protecting it all fell squarely on my shoulders. My daughter Sarah had always been the apple of his eye, and when she brought home Brad Mitchell for Christmas dinner, I studied him closely. His smile was polished, his compliments well-timed, but there was a sharpness behind his charm that reminded me of a shark circling still water. Sarah was glowing, caught in the joy of new love, but I couldn't shake my unease. She told me how Brad had endured tragedy, how his first wife had died in a car accident, and how he had finally found the courage to open his heart again. I smiled politely, poured more wine, and watched the way his eyes wandered not with affection for Sarah, but with calculation measuring the weight of the chandelier, the price of the silver, the worth of everything that surrounded us. I chose silence then, telling myself it was better not to stir conflict so early. After all, if Sarah was happy, wasn't that enough? But intuition is a stubborn companion, and mine refused to let me rest. By the time the beach wedding arrived in June, my suspicions had hardened into certainty. Brad played his role perfectly, promising to protect and cherish my daughter in front of family and friends, his voice thick with sincerity. Yet as I dabbed my eyes with a handkerchief, it wasn't tears of joy I was holding back. It was the urge to stand up, to shatter the illusion with what I had already uncovered. Because 6 months earlier, I had hired a private investigator named Frank Romano. He was the kind of man who thrived in chaos, his office piled high with case files and photographs, his words precise but heavy with implication. When he handed me Brad's real story, I felt the floor tilt beneath my feet. Brad Mitchell did not exist. His real name was Brandon Michaelson, and his history was a trail of broken lives and vanished women. 3 previous marriages, each one to a woman with wealth. His supposed first wife had not died in a car crash. She had disappeared after accusing him of theft. Other women had been left with drained accounts. Businesses collapsed, reputations in ruins. Every few years, he changed his name, moved states, and reinvented himself. My daughter was not his first target, and she would not be his last unless someone stopped him. 3 weeks after the wedding, Brad arrived at my door with a briefcase and a lawyer in tow. They settled into my living room with the arrogance of men who believed the outcome was already decided. Brad spoke first, his tone silky as he claimed his right to know about our family's financial position. California was a community property state, he reminded me, implying Sarah's marriage entitled him to my late husband's empire. I listened, calm and deliberate, as his lawyer slid across the table a trust document. On its surface, it looked protective, generous even. But buried deep was the clause that gave Brad power of attorney if I became incapacitated. It was theft disguised as estate planning. I smiled politely and told them I would review it with my attorney. They didn't know I had already seen every part of their scheme before it reached my table. What they didn't know was that the spider's web had already been spun, and they were the ones tangled in it. I proposed my own condition: full financial disclosure from both of them, complete transparency of assets and debts. The room grew tense. Brad's mask slipped for the briefest moment, the twitch of a muscle near his eye betraying the truth. He could not produce a clean history, because his history was nothing but lies. They left soon after, shaken but not yet defeated. I watched them go, poured myself a glass of wine, and called Frank. Brad would run, I told him, because that was all he could do when cornered, and run he did, within days. Sarah was left crying on her couch, abandoned with no explanation. She turned to me for comfort, demanding answers, and for the first time I told her everything. The name changes, the missing wife, the pattern of predation. But Sarah, blinded by love and betrayal, could not bring herself to accept it. She accused me of paranoia, of meddling, of driving away the man she believed she loved. For weeks. She shut me out, silence heavier than any argument could have been. It was only when she returned, thinner and hollow-eyed, that the wall between us began to crack. She asked to see everything, every page of Frank's file, every photograph, every record of fraud. And as the truth unfolded, piece by devastating piece, Sarah's grief hardened into resolve. She wanted justice not just for herself, but for the other women Brandon had deceived. She wanted to stop him before he could find his next victim. Her determination lit something inside me. For years, I had played the role of protector, quietly guarding the empire Thomas built. But now my daughter was standing beside me, ready to fight. We decided together if Brad returned, if he reached out again, we would set the trap ourselves. Frank warned us that the first move had to look like love, not strategy. So Sarah composed a message with trembling hands, telling Brad she had been miserable without him, that she believed in forgiveness, that I regretted pushing him away. The reply arrived within minutes, as if he had been waiting with the phone in his palm. He loved her, he said. He was ready to talk. He wanted to come home. By the next afternoon at 2:47 p.m., his rental car rolled into her apartment complex, from my sedan across the street. I watched my daughter step into his arms as if grief had rewired her spine to bend toward the man who broke her. She wore a wire beneath a soft sweater. Frank's team sat in an unmarked van, their headphones tilted like dark halos as they captured everything. The plan was simple. Let him steer the conversation toward my properties, coax out his methods, and record clear intent to defraud. Simple plans rarely survive contact with professionals. Inside Sarah's apartment, his voice was a balm poured over a wound he had made. He spoke about fear, about being overwhelmed, about wanting children and stability and safety. 5 minutes in, he pivoted to my estate as if it were a natural extension of affection. The coastal holdings were vulnerable. He said market swings, environmental regulation, climate risk. He suggested structures and strategies with the fluency of a man who had spent years learning the language of wealth. A family-limited partnership, protective entities, tax efficiencies. My daughter asked careful questions, and he answered with even more careful restraint. He never used a word that implied theft. He said protect, diversify, steward, preserve. It was like watching a surgeon who refused to bleed. The next evening, I hosted him in my living room. He arrived with flowers and a polished apology, and for 15 patient minutes, we played at reconciliation over wine and cheese, while Frank's equipment captured the theater. Then Brad laid out his proposal with practiced calm. I would keep control 60%, he suggested. To soothe my pride, Sarah would hold 35% as heir. He would take 5%, a modest stake, just enough to execute the strategies that would shield and grow the legacy Thomas built. 5% of $30 million might sound small to a layperson, to an operator. It's a foothold wide enough to drive a fortune through. He never rushed, never pressed, never slipped into the naked hunger I had seen the day he arrived with his lawyer. He was disciplined now, and discipline is the mask that keeps monsters from showing their teeth. When he left, I stared at the flowers sitting like trophies on my table and felt unease coil around the stem of my certainty. Frank called me at 8 p.m. His FBI contact was concerned. The recordings were clean, too clean. Everything Brad said could be defended as legitimate planning. No overt coercion, no explicit intent. If he suspected surveillance, he had turned our trap into a shield. The following morning, the shield turned into a blade. Sarah found a note on her kitchen table. He knew what we were doing. He accused her of betrayal. He was gone. Frank ordered us to pack bags and come to his office by 10 a.m. The word he used was danger, and it landed like a stone on my chest. Agent Rebecca Martinez from the FBI met us there, brisk and unsentimental. She'd been chasing Brandon Michaelson for 3 years, she said. And he slipped through fingers the way smoke slips through a fist. A vague note would not meet the threshold for a criminal threat. Recording a man proposing not to steal but to structure. That was not evidence, it was plausible deniability. The law can be a fortress for the careful and a sieve for the bold. At 11:47 p.m., my phone rang. Unknown number, the kind that pries open the night. Brad's voice was surprisingly gentle. He told me I was clever for hiring Frank, that he should have given me more credit. Then he began to rearrange the furniture inside my mind. He said his first wife was alive and living in Seattle, that her disappearance was a messy divorce, legal, not lethal. He said the Phoenix widow, Victoria Chen, had been sophisticated and consenting, that she lost money in some ventures but made more in others. That loneliness can look like vulnerability when seen through the eyes of adult children who want a docile parent. He was offering me a story in which he was not a predator, but a lightning rod for the judgment of people who could not tolerate women taking risks with their own lives. Sarah shook her head wildly, mouthing, "Don't." I listened anyway. He asked me to drive to a property in Carmel at 12:30 a.m. to hear Victoria's version. Claimed she was willing to speak on the record. It stank of a setup, and yet he'd hooked the thing that runs deeper than fear. Curiosity paired with dignity. Agent Martinez mobilized immediately, dispatching units while Frank confirmed the address belonged to one of Thomas's vacant cliff houses. We drove beneath a moon that seemed to keep its own counsel. The Pacific looked like cooled steel. Brad waited in the driveway with empty hands. An elegant woman with silver hair soon emerged and introduced herself as Victoria Chen in a voice that carried the confidence of a boardroom. Inside the house, with agents stationed outside like punctuation marks on the night, she told us a story that did not fit our case file. She described a relationship she had chosen, risks she had weighed, and a portfolio that had risen by $1,200,000 overall. She said the charges were born not of fraud, but of family panic, that her adult children had pressured her to press for elder abuse because autonomy looks like madness when people prefer you compliant. I wanted to dismiss it. I wanted the world to be simple. I also wanted the room to stop spinning. Because her questions, have they respected your judgment since your husband died? Do they treat you like a person or a vault slid into cracks? I had sealed with duty. Brad offered a real partnership after that, no romance, just capital and expertise, profit sharing, and the promise of velocity that traditional advisors avoid, legal. Agent Martinez admitted reluctantly, if entered into by competent adults with clear disclosures. Sarah's face held a fury I recognized from childhood tantrums, but now it was lined with dread and love. She saw a hook where I saw an opening. We drove home in silence so loud it pressed at my eardrums. When we pulled into my driveway at 2 a.m., Sarah was waiting, accusations already on her tongue. I told her what Victoria had claimed. Agent Martinez confirmed that the basics checked out alive, coherent. Initially defensive of Brad before family pressure shifted the narrative. Sarah begged me not to believe it, to recognize manipulation when it wore a suit and a soft voice. I snapped that I was trying to see clearly. And in the snap, I heard something that scared me more than Brad's, pitch the edge of a war between my daughter's fear and my right to live as more than a bank with a pulse. My phone buzzed at 11:47 p.m. again the following night with an ultimatum cloaked in opportunity: Hong Kong. A seat beside him at meetings where returns moved like weather. A midnight deadline. The house was quiet except for the ocean breathing against the cliff. I had a choice to make about the rest of my life. At 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before his deadline, I sat at my desk with a pen in hand, staring at a document I had never wanted to write. It was a power of attorney, granting Sarah control over my affairs if anything happened to me. Not because I trusted her completely, but because I understood now the line between precaution and paralysis. Then, with a calmness that surprised me, I texted Brad back, "I'll be ready in the morning." The choice was mine. When dawn came, a black sedan arrived at 6 a.m., sleek and unmarked. Brad stepped out in a tailored suit, hair neat, the air of a man in control of everything, including perception. He asked if I was certain. I told him I was sure of only one thing: I refused to keep living as if fear was my master. The plane to Hong Kong lifted off just past noon, carrying me further from Sarah than any distance ever had. She would wake to an empty house, to the bitter discovery that her mother had chosen risk over safety, agency over obedience. The months that followed passed like a fever dream. Brad and I were not lovers, but partners. Two people who had struck a bargain between caution and charisma. He brought contacts, doors into investment worlds I had never walked through. I brought capital and decades of experience watching Thomas negotiate risk with steel nerves. We worked in boardrooms in Singapore, in shaded cafes in Bangkok, in high-rise offices in Hong Kong, where the windows looked out over harbors glittering with possibility. For every deal that burned to ash, 2 others doubled in fire 3 months later. My portfolio was worth $42 million. When I returned, my skin carried the bronze of Thai sunlight, my luggage held contracts instead of souvenirs, and my heart carried something heavier than triumph, a clarity about who I was and who I was not. Sarah met me at the airport, eyes wide, her arms wrapping me like she was afraid I would vanish again. She whispered that she had been terrified, that she had imagined every terrible outcome. I held her and told her something true. Something did happen to me. I remembered who I was before the world decided I was fragile. She bristled at Brad's shadow still hanging over me. I told her she didn't need to trust him. She only needed to trust me. For the first time in years, I trusted myself. We drove home in silence, the weight of love and suspicion between us like an uninvited passenger. But the truth is never as clean as financial reports. Trust is messier than wire transfers. Late at night, I thought of Victoria Chen's words about her children, about being treated as incompetent because age had drawn lines on her face. I thought about Sarah's fear and her fury, about whether they had sprung from love or from the hunger to control the inheritance she imagined was hers. I thought about Brad, a man who might be predator, might be partner, might be both in different lights. And I thought about Thomas, who once told me as we watched a construction site collapse under a bad contractor, Failure only defines you if you let it be the last thing you build. I hadn't let failure define me. Neither had Sarah, though she might not see it yet. Her tears, her anger, her pleas, all of it was rooted in the same soil as my choice to get on that plane. Love. Love expressed differently, dangerously, imperfectly. It's easy to draw lines between victims and villains, between family and strangers, between safety and danger. It's harder to live in the blurred spaces, where protecting someone can look like betrayal, and trusting yourself can look like madness. At 68, I learned the most valuable lesson of my life. That dignity is not something others hand you. It's something you claim, even if the claim costs you peace. That safety without freedom is just another kind of prison, and that the only approval you truly need for your choices, whether to stay silent at a wedding, to sign a trust, or to board a plane to the other side of the world, is your own. If you've stayed with me through this story, thank you. I hope it reminds you that the lines others draw for us age. Fear. Family don't have to be the walls we live within. Take risks, claim your choices, and never let anyone else decide what you're capable of. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me your thoughts. I'd love to hear your voice. Together, we build not just stories, but reminders that none of us are alone in facing the blurred edges of life.